This week, we have two outstanding segments for you on the show. First up is Lenny Zeltser, who is, of course, the VP of Products for MinervaLabs. Prior to that, John and I have known Lenny for a long time via SANS, so it should be a really interesting conversation with Lenny as we talk a little bit about endpoints and such. Then in the enterprise we've got threat metrics. Palo Alto is making a product announcement. CrowdStrike, Sumo Logic, Big Switch, Kaseya, and Carbon Black also makes an announcement. So we'll be covering all the enterprise news on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. The teleprompter now has artificial intelligence, Doug, and updates itself. It's awesome. This week, and talk about them as it relates to enterprise security. You're gonna do great.
I think that people think that you and I talk like every day at night. You know, It's like, hey, what are you doing? It's kind of a bit of an exhausting week, and I think that we noticed that a little bit in the stories for this week as well.
MinervaLabs stops malware that traditional antivirus solutions cannot block. Minerva works with your existing anti-malware tools to stop evasive threats by deceiving them into a dormant state, dramatically increasing your rate of prevention. Minerva's solution does not require ongoing care and feeding and will not get in the way of business users. With Minerva, adversaries have to pick their poison, implement evasive tactics and get caught by Minerva, or don't employ evasion and get stopped by AV. To learn more and request a demo, visit minerva-labs.com today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. I'm excited to be here. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. This is episode number 77, lucky 77, for Wednesday, January 24th, 2018. On the lines via Skype, we'll bring along Mr. John Strand is here with us. John, welcome to the program today.
Very good to be back after being in Philadelphia for the last show. I was out and traveling, but it's awesome to be back on Enterprise Security Weekly.
Fantastic. Nice to have you, John. Let's see, a quick announcement before we get started. I just want to mention our wonderful sponsor, IT Pro TV, of course. They've got an ever-expanding course library. They've even, to go along with our discussion today, have a 10-hour module on antivirus and anti-malware, if you want to get caught up on that, as well as other types of training. But, that one just kind of caught my eye this morning. You should use them because, we use them as well here at Security Weekly. So make sure you check out itpro.tv/Security Weekly. Excuse me. Our in-studio guest is here today, Mr. Lenny Zeltser, who has a long career in security. Lenny and I and John, we've known each other for a really long time. In fact, currently, of course, Lenny is the VP of Products at MinervaLabs. Prior to that, you were at NCR and then Savvis, and you are a world-renowned expert in the field of malware, I would say, which is why I was very happy to see you at MinervaLabs, where you get to apply a lot of the skills you've learned, including some of the skills in malware, as well as security products. So that's awesome. Lenny, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
So, Lenny, tell us a little bit about MinervaLabs and your role at Minerva.
MinervaLabs is designed to stop malware on the endpoint that is designed to get past other security controls. I think over the years that I've spent in security, together with the other folks at Minerva, we found that it's not practical to rely on antivirus alone on the endpoint to protect it. And we keep deploying various controls. Many of them end up being ineffective. We keep swinging the pendulum the other way, away from prevention to perhaps try to detect threats, and find that that's overly time-consuming if you don't prevent enough up front. So we designed a solution that causes malware to break if it tries to get around other security tools. And it's quite a unique solution. And for me, it's very gratifying to be working on creating a product that stops malware. I've been doing product management for longer than I realized until I counted the years a few days ago. But this is the first time where I get to directly impact a software solution that stops malware beyond merely integrating or using other companies' solutions. And that's pretty cool.
Is it accurate to say that there's a component of deception in Minerva's products?
Yeah, that's the how. That's some of the mechanisms that we use behind the scenes. Overall, I've been a huge fan of employing principles of deception to get defenders an edge over the adversaries in various ways. Now, I am lately a little bit hesitant to lead with the idea of deception when talking to people who are not familiar already with what I do, because right away when people think deception, they assume something having to do with network honeypots, because those technologies use a lot of deception in their approaches. That's one way to use deception, but there are so many. Unfortunately, a lot of industry analysts have defined, by their definition, deception means deception of the network. But you can use deception to get an edge over adversaries in so many different ways. Simply creating a user account in Active Directory that nobody's supposed to use, and then setting up an alert that notifies you when somebody tries to log into it. That's a use of deception. It has nothing to do with my product, but that's yet another example of deception. And in the case of MinervaLabs, we employ deception on the endpoint, not on the network, to fool malware regarding what's there, what's not, so that it stops working properly. We lie to it regarding some of the dependencies that it's designed to look for, so that when it doesn't find them, it fails. We lie to it regarding the kind of environment where it's running, so that when it thinks it's being reverse engineered, it chooses to shut itself down. So yeah, lots of ways of using deception, and that's what we're doing on the endpoint specifically.
John, questions for Lenny as Lenny, you did a great job defining deception and its uses, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions both from the analyst and in the market about that. So, John, questions for Lenny along the lines of deception.
So where exactly do you guys actually put in your deception layer on the system itself? Because I think a lot of people are real hazy on how that actually works. Are they actually shimming processes as they're running? Is it a kernel level, like Windows-based rootkit that's lying to any processes that may be asking some common questions of the kernel that malware tends to ask? So where exactly does your product actually hook into the endpoint to actually provide that level of deception back to the malware?
So to control how software that runs on Windows perceives its reality, well, what that really means is that we're interfering with commonly used API calls that all software uses to query the state of the file system, the state of the registry, the state of other processes. To accomplish that, we're using a user mode agent, not a kernel mode agent. And that's kind of a big deal, and from my perspective, a very desirable property. Now, in part, it is desirable because a lot of anti-malware technologies have been criticized for running too much code in the kernel, which some say actually increases the attack surface of the system, because you've got so many different parsers running in the kernel. If there's a bug in that code, then the whole system is affected. Now, we're running purely in user mode, and this allows us to be much less invasive on the system. Another reason why it's a big deal, but very difficult to implement what we do at the user mode, is that this ensures compatibility with both past and future versions of Windows, because we don't rely on the undocumented or really low-level capabilities of the kernel, which Microsoft patches once in a while, like, I don't know, a few weeks ago, which ended up breaking a lot of security tools that had kernel mode components. So yeah, we run in the user mode, but still we have the ability to intercept API calls that malware uses to get information about what's there, and we intercept these calls so that we provide the answer before the operating system has a chance to answer, and that allows us to lie.
Okay, very, very cool. So I got another question, and this is something I just kind of want to figure out what's going on. Secdo, you have Symmetria. there's all of these different Israeli companies that are really kind of coming up with innovative technologies. What is going on right now in Israel with security companies really coming up with these types of completely novel, different approaches, like Javelin, Sectu, you guys, Symmetria with Gadi Avron? What happened that all of a sudden now Israel seems to be kind of the leading country coming out with companies with cyber deception and brand new approaches to computer security?
So indeed, I think as you're implying, Minerva is an Israeli-based company, and my perspective on why there's so much interesting security technology coming out of Israel is that you've got the mindset of the people that are constantly under the threat of an attack, and that mindset leads you into thinking about threats and defenses in creative and practical ways. Also, you have a country that relies heavily, I think, on export of these kinds of ideas, right? It's a relatively small country, but one with a lot of ideas. And when technology is created there, validated locally that it works, then there's an opportunity to export this technology by way of creating companies that sell their products to other markets. So in the case of Minerva, we had founders who were responsible at some point for security and IT administration of a whole lot of endpoints, and they needed a solution that not only protects them against modern threats, but also is practical to use. Practical, because there's a lot of really cool security approaches that sound very promising to a security professional. Let's say, I don't know, application whitelisting, which I used to rely upon quite a lot in the former years. But then when you deploy them in the field, you realize that there's a lot of operational burdens and real-world scenarios that might end up interfering with what you think would be perfect. So I guess my perspective is that the mindset of Israeli companies is one that is grounded in threats, attacks, defenses, and real-world experience.
Cool. Lenny, so let's talk a little bit about real-world experience. Do you have any success stories from customers that have been running this so far? Or anything you can share with us and our listeners?
Yeah. Without naming any specific customers, which I'm unable to do, it's very pleasing to be in product management when you create security products, because you design a piece of software, the team builds it, you make it available to customers, and then you get to observe to see it doing a good deed without you having to actually do the things your own at that point in real time, which is different.
That's the most positive view I've ever heard on product management before. So you're in a great place, Lenny, because
I am an optimistic person.
Yeah, usually it's we're listening to our customers and mostly ignoring them, and then we're trying to convince developers to put in the features that are being requested, and the developers do whatever they want.
No, that's not the case.
You described a very different scenario from that. So good for you. Good for you.
I used to do a lot of security consulting, which I loved. But the problem with security consulting is that you, in order to provide value, you have to be there. Like while you're working, that is when you're doing something useful. When you stop working, because once in a while you got to sleep, for example, or you want to spend time with your family, the value being provided is stopped because it's tied so much to you as a consultant doing the work. In the case of product management, building security software, you know what? You spend a lot of time designing it, building it, bringing it to your customers, and then the software is there, you leave it behind, and it does the good thing that you designed it to do. So we found that Minerva is getting a lot of traction within organizations that for various practical reasons are having a hard time locking down their environment very, very, very tightly. There are a lot of organizations like that. In fact, when we as security professionals talk to other security professionals, in many cases we're talking to, let's call them the 1%ers, organizations that have security programs that are highly mature, where you've got 5 different security layers already installed and active, and you're thinking about the 6th one. But in many cases, most organizations in the world are not like that. So, for example, municipalities. You've got a lot of distributed systems that are loosely managed by various departments. That's one success story that I recently encountered with a customer that had an environment that was suffering from a lot of attacks that were able to get past their baseline security tools. They put Minerva in place. And one of the nice things about our technology is that our customers don't need to spend time configuring our software in order for it to stop blocking malware that bypasses antivirus. So we do it automatically. And that lends itself very well to those organizations that don't have a dedicated security staff or don't have the expertise to tune a solution that they otherwise would have configured if they had the time. So one scenario where we're getting a lot of traction is these types of organizations that deploy us into an environment as part of their security stack on the endpoint. and they add us on top of antivirus because that's how the software is designed to run.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's people out there listening, they're going, well, I have antivirus. Why do I need to put another layer on top of that? And, I guess first address the major players in the market that are large enterprises that are running the big name, antivirus vendors that have been there forever. Why should they start considering adding a layer on top of that with Minerva? Because you're not looking to displace.
Exactly. We don't displace antivirus. Yeah, we fill the gap that we believe is there, regardless of what antivirus tool you've deployed into your environment. Now, overall, the idea of augmenting the protection that you get from antivirus on the endpoint, it's not brand new. We have had technologies that say, well, AV is going to be giving you the efficacy of X, whatever that X is, and we can talk about that figure if you want. But then we say, okay, what do we do with the rest? With the rest of the attacks that get past my baseline AV. Maybe I'm going to put in some EDR technology to detect those attacks so that I can respond to them quickly, or maybe I'm going to put in software that does exploit mitigation, for example. So the idea that you're going to be putting software on top of AV is not brand new. But organizations have been burned by a lot of technologies that they put on top of AV because they ended up requiring a lot of time to maintain, or their performance was such that it brought down the whole endpoint. And guess what? If the endpoint is not performing its business function, then even though it's really secure, it's not very useful to business. But overall, our perspective on antivirus is that, first of all, let's call it my perspective, because I've been looking at the endpoint security space for a while. And for the longest time, I have seen antivirus vendors become a little bit stale in their rate of innovation. And that was until, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. And at that point, because we had some new entrants into the space, the whole antivirus industry started innovating much more rapidly than I believe they have been doing up until that point. And now you've got modern antivirus solutions that are coming from young companies. You've got established players bringing innovation into their existing products. So it's a good time to be alive. There's a lot of really cool things happening with AV that we haven't seen for a long time. And even though, let's say, last year, people would oftentimes try to make a distinction between traditional AV players and next generation AV players, right now I think it's all becoming a bit of a blur. And that term next gen is losing its meaning. Now you've got traditional players that have next gen goodness baked into their products, and you've got next gen players that are adding some of the capabilities that they have laughed at from the traditional players into their products as well. But my point is this. Yes. Oh, this was the point.
Go ahead.
Get to the point. This is the gist. My point is this. Attackers are innovating as well. AV vendors are innovating, attackers are innovating, and that dynamic will not go away. And that is because no matter what technology, what algorithms you use to perform AV-like functions, you're still grounded in the idea that to protect the system, you're going to be scanning a file to see if it looks like previously seen malware, or you're going to be scanning a process to see if it behaves like previously seen malware. And then you decide whether to block access to a file that you think is malicious, or whether to kill a process that you think is malicious. And by making some tweaks to malware and testing it before deploying it into the field, you will always find a way around that type of technology. That's the gap that I'm talking about. And the way that I want to stop that gap together with my colleagues at Minerva is to have a way for malware self-convict without me ever having to scan a file or a process, because that's what AV vendors do, and I don't want to compete with that kind of technology.
That's interesting. John,
let's talk a little bit about that self-conviction. The idea of infection markers, whether it's a registry key, a process mutex, anything like that. You guys actually have released some open source tools in the community as well. Could you talk a little bit about Mystique and how it can kind of support this overall process?
So yeah, Mystique is a nice tool that a lot of people can play with. It's open source. It's designed to work together with the popular and freely available Cuckoo sandbox. But before I talk about the Mystique specifically, let's talk about the functionality that this tool is designed to support. The idea here is also grounded in an element of deception, and it focuses on malware that is designed to only infect a system once. It's actually a very common common characteristic of a lot of malware families, where a malicious program will check to see whether it's already present on the endpoint, and if it thinks it's already present on the endpoint, then it will choose not to infect it, because infecting it more than once causes operational stability problems. So the idea that we had, and we implemented this as part of our product, is that we can fool malware into thinking that it's already present on the system, and this way it will choose not to infect it. Now, in this case, this particular module that's a part of our broader solution allows our customers to mimic the presence of certain infection markers that the corresponding malware families use to signal their presence on the system. An infection marker in many cases is a specific mutex object that a malicious process will create when infecting the system for the first time, and it'll check whether the mutex exists when trying to infect it again. The mutex is there, it's not going to infect. So our solution allows customers to simulate the presence of those infection markers. Now, Mystique is a free tool that we released to make it easier for incident responders and malware analysts to derive information about these infection markers automatically. And the way that it does this is by plugging into the popular, freely available Cuckoo malware analysis sandbox. It detonates the malware sample that the analyst is examining in the sandbox and observes what effects that sample has on the environment. It looks specifically for the potential infection markers that it may have created. Then it automatically detonates the same sample again in the same environment, but in the second case, it automatically creates the potential infection markers, and it observes whether that presence of the infection marker affected the behavior of the sample. If, for example, by creating a potential mutex object, we caused that malware sample to run for a lesser period of time or to just terminate itself right away, we know that that's probably an infection marker that could be used as a vaccine.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Now, the idea behind
what do you mean by a mutex marker?
By the way,
example?
A mutex, that's perhaps an overly technical term for depending on the background of the individual. But a mutex object it's an artifact that is present on all Microsoft Windows systems. There are lots of mutex objects that are present on any Windows box. And this particular object is designed, there's nothing malicious about it, it's designed for processes to control access to a shared resource. So if you have, for example, multiple processes trying to write to the same file, one way to ensure that one process doesn't step on the toes of the other process is for those processes to try to access the mutex at the same time. And a mutex is like a flag that only one entity can hold. So the operating system will allow one of the processes to grab the mutex, the other one would be unable to do so, and that's how that second process knows that someone else is busy doing whatever work the process does not want to interfere with. So because of this functionality, mutex objects lend themselves very nicely to being infection markers because only one can exist on a given system at once. But malware uses other infection markers as well sometimes. These could be files that are created by the malware sample during the infection, could be specific registry keys as well.
That's interesting. Lenny, it seems like the Minerva products and the approach you're taking is after some type of exploitation has taken place and a process is being run. Is there concern that the attacker is making kind of headway into the system and then at that point it's getting stopped? Like we're not stopping any of the execution or installation of the payload, it's when it actually runs. I don't know if you run into that objection.
Well, no, actually, if you look at how the technology works, just the opposite is true with the way that we're able to intercept attempts by malware to access its environment. In fact, our interference is very typically early in the process, at the downloader stage or at the dropper stage. And the reason for this is because when you think about malware trying to get past baseline antivirus tools, in many cases, that initial payload is designed to look normal. And therefore, if it looks at it, says, oh, that looks okay. It tries to run, but then to do damage on the system, that payload would need to unpack itself somehow, maybe into its own memory space, into the memory space of another process, or that payload might look around to see if it's safe to unpack in this environment because it doesn't want to be reverse engineered. So those actions take place very, very early in the execution of the sample before it does any damage. So we're able to interfere before damage is done, and before, and this is important, a human adversary gets involved. Because, John, we're talking about the use of deception as a way of giving defenders a leg up over the attackers. it's very hard to fool a human being, right? A thinking, intelligent human being. And if you already have an adversary that's remotely controlling the system, perhaps trying to steal data or spread laterally, it's hard. It's hard to fool a human. But the way that we employ deception, because it's very early before human gets involved, it's much more effective because it's easier to fool a computer program that's been pre-designed to do something.
Now, take notes, folks, because Lenny described all of that without using the phrase kill chain. So
that's awesome. But also, Lenny, you and I have had the conversation about using deception and how humans can get around deception. But to kind of springboard back on that, if you're an attacker, a human attacker, the first thing that you have to do is be aware that the trap exists. And a lot of times the deception trap has to be triggered before the bad guy, the human bad guy, can actually interact and then try to bypass that. So that's one of the things we hear a lot. They're like, well, a human being would be able to identify this, but they'd have to fall into that hole. They'd have to fall into that trap before they could actually start trying to find ways around it, correct?
Maybe. Again, my focus is on not trying to fool humans because I think that's very, very hard. My focus is on trying to fool computer software that was written by the human and then launched into space, let's say, right? And once it's out there, before human can control it, it has to do something. It has to detonate its payload. It has to embed itself into the system. It has to establish some kind of a command and control channel to the adversary. So I'm trying to prevent it from happening by fooling it regarding what's real, what's not, before human gets involved. So I think that stands a much higher chance of succeeding. Because ultimately, as security professionals, I think it's a lot of fun to think about deception. It's an intellectually curious approach, but ultimately nobody cares whether you're using deception to protect systems or whether you're using telepathy, right? It just needs to work. It has to be an approach that doesn't replicate what you already got. It has to be an approach that's effective, and it has to be an approach that does not take more time to implement and to configure than you're giving back the organization by securing its endpoints.
That's awesome. So you mentioned some free tools out there for folks. Where can they find some of these free tools, and just give us a breakdown to kind of close things out?
we have a GitHub that you can find with a bit of Googling. Mystique is the tool that I had mentioned that allows you to start experimenting with automatically deriving infection markers. And you can easily find it online. That's awesome.
And so MinervaLabs.com? Is that the
Minerva-labs.com.
Minerva-labs.com. Now, you offer a free trial?
So we certainly offer a free trial, but it's not a consumer product, right? It's an enterprise product. So therefore, we ask organizations to reach out to us and tell us about their needs. And this will allows us to create an environment where they can experiment with the product in a way that's best suited for them. For example, in one set of environments, we can deploy our product onto just any generic enterprise endpoint, and that's quite common. In other scenarios, we can tune the product to protect special purpose devices like medical devices or point of sale systems or ATMs. And in that case, we might want to tweak the configuration so that it's just right for that kind of an environment. In other cases, we have customers that have helped us find a use case that I have not anticipated. I'm a product manager, which means that I get to decide together with my colleagues what it is we're building and how I think our customers are going to be using the product. So initially we thought, okay, enterprises looking to beef up their ability to deter adversaries and to prevent attacks, deploy us preemptively, we help secure your endpoints. We, as a pleasant surprise, have gained some traction among incident responders that are using us to contain a threat by deploying us into an infested environment, which I didn't expect that initially, but it ends up being quite interesting, because when you're responding to an incident, when you know you've got the presence of an adversary in your environment, or when you think you've got a malware infestation, well, what do? Ultimately, you want to get those systems back up and running as quickly as possible, but before you can remove the malicious software, the attacker's tools, before you can re-image those boxes, you have to stop the damage. And so because we are so easy to deploy and don't break other security products, incident responders have deployed us into the field and contain the threat automatically, and then they can clean up the system. So that's the kind of use case that we got by customers reaching out to us and talking to us about their needs.
That's really cool. Well, you can find them at Minerva-Labs.com. Minerva's a proud sponsor here on Security Weekly. It was an awesome discussion, Lenny, and I like some of those use cases at the end where it can be a preventative measure, but also be a tactical tool as well. There is a trial that you can go register for, as well as some free tools to play around with. So, Lenny, thank you so much.
All right, it's good to be here.
With that, we're going to take a short break and come back, talk about the enterprise security news for this week. So stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.